G'day folks, my name is Rob and welcome back for another video. Today I will be talking to the big boss himself, Nate Saunders, ESPN's general editor for Formula One. You might know Nate from his features on ESPN's Mighty and McGee or photos you've seen of him celebrating the promotion of Ipswich Town to the Premier League in May of 2024 with aspiring musical talent Ed Sheeran. Today, Nate and I are going to delve into all of the Formula One storylines coming up for 2025, his career in motorsport journalism, and his book Forza Ferrari, due for release in March of this year. So if you enjoy what you see, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel. And if you'd like to see other incredible guests like Nate on the channel this year, let me know down in the comments below. I hope you enjoy the video. Ladies and gents, today I'm joined by Nate Saunders, General Editor of Formula One at ESPN and co-host of ESPN's Unlapped podcast. Nate's also 1/3 of the Pad-Hoc show, which he hosts with Chris Medland and Lawrence Barretto. So if you know those faces, I'm sure you also know Nate. Nate, thanks for coming on today, mate. How's your season been?
Yeah, you've just made me realize how I do too many podcasts, basically. In my, I'm on too many, Unlapped and Pad-Hoc. But no, things are good. It's been, fairly... It's kind of a long off season in F1, but it quickly comes around to the point we're at now, where we're like 2 weeks away from testing. We've got the launch event coming up, so things are good. How about you? How's the anticipation building for the new season?
Mate, it's not been too bad. I don't know. I think everyone's different right at this time of year. You're just easing back into it, unless you're covering every team and every driver, but. No, I've enjoyed the downtime, and I mean, I don't know if it extends to journalists and other people in the profession, but for someone that just does content around F1 fantasy, there's like a little bit of burnout, but I can't really say it stacks up.
Yeah, no, I think it is. It from a media side, it definitely is the case, and actually, I think that any sport needs a bit of time off. You need to rebuild that anticipation. I know a lot of fans when you leave Abu Dhabi at the end of the season, they go, I can't believe there's 100 days to the F1. It's like, no, that's a good thing. The NFL has 9 months when nothing really happens, on the pitch, and yet it's still the biggest sport. And I love the NFL. So I think it's good. And yeah, the burnout. I mean, they're long years, they're long seasons now. So I mean, towards the end of last season, very very lucky to be able to travel and do the things and cover the things I do. But it's a lot of time zone changes, and you get to December, and your brain is a bit wiped, and then you realize that's just media. I know a lot of the mechanics and engineers and stuff, and I mean for them it's twofold, threefold. So I think I think I've definitely got the easiest gig in terms of that. But yeah, it's a real thing. And the good thing about burnout is it disappears quickly. So
yeah, I know.
The season's back.
It was quite funny, right before Christmas is when the season wraps up. So I feel as though, 1 or 2 weeks removed from Abu Dhabi, we kind of put it out of our minds, or at least I do anyway. So, I mean, I'm sure most people watching are familiar with your work and kind of what you do for ESPN. But, we've caught up in the past and spoken about kind of your career and stuff generally. But, I've never really drilled into kind of how long you've been in the sport for. It's like 10 plus years now, and I'm sure littered with so many different memories and interviews and stories and such you've covered. Can you just share with me and everyone kind of some highlights that you've had over the years? Any particular ones that particularly stand out to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this will be my 11th year covering Formula One. I started in 2014, so I started right when the Mercedes and Lewis Hamilton dominant era begun. So there was a spell where all I'd covered was Mercedes championships, and in 21, I can't tell you how I was like, I wasn't rooting for either team, but it's like it'd be nice to write about another team winning the championship. But obviously that's been changing over the last few years now. And yeah, I mean it's a funny thing with journalism, because the first couple of years I did it, I was kind of desk based. I would just be working in London, which is I work for ESPN, but in our London bureau, or at least I worked there. Now I still go in occasionally, but I didn't really start attending races properly until 2016. I went to the 2015 Spanish Grand Prix to cover. That was my first one. And then I actually was the first couple I did in 2016 were very consequential. So I had Russia 2016, which is where Kvyat went into the back of Vettel, put him in the wall, and then Vettel went to the Red Bull pit wall about 3 days later. I remember getting back from Russia, and there were rumours, maybe they're going to remove Kvyat. They obviously did. I then went to Spain, and that's where Lewis and Nico had their crash, and then Max won that race. So for that to be one of the first races I properly covered, that storyline was pretty great, and you were right in the thick of it. And I remember actually that Spanish Grand Prix. It was one of the first real tough decisions I had to make as a journalist. I was like, what's the story here? Is it Lewis and Nico have just had a crash, or is it Max Verstappen just won his first race and he's the youngest driver ever to win it? Both incredible stories, but obviously we'd had 3 years of the Lewis and Nico Rosberg feud. It was the title battle, so that was great. And ended up you end up covering them both, but you got to prioritize one. So, and then since then I've done more and more each year, and obviously the benefit of doing that is you get to know so many people in the sport. You've got a phone full of contacts that you can message when you need to stand stories up. It's funny, you end up having kind of a bizarre kind of like group of friends who work for different teams and do different things, and you're all kind of united by the love of the sport and stuff. And I think people sometimes forget that ultimately everyone in the sport knows each other, and there's people that don't like each other, but there's a lot of people that do like each other as well. Yeah. I know you've obviously stepped in and out of the paddock a couple of times too, and it is quite amazing how many people are there. So yeah. I mean, 11 years. I mean, hadn't probably sat and thought about it until now. But I mean, it's a great stint, And last year I covered 18 races, on location, and out of the 24. So that I think was quite comfortably the most I've done. Usually I do about 14, 15, because you try and to do all 24 would probably come close to killing you. In terms of if you're doing it economy. I've managed to start getting premium economy flights, which is a massive brag. But after 11 years, I'm like, I feel like I need these now. So yeah, it's honestly it's a great thing to do. And I mean anything else you want to know about it? Obviously ask away.
I mean, it's funny you say 18 races out of 24 last year. I think the last 2 years I've done 2 each, and I thought that was quite something. And I think we met after maybe the only second race I'd been to in Vegas 2023, which
That's
is
right.
And I remember coming in. I think we only had a couple of brief interactions that weekend, but understood you were on a private jet, or
that's right.
So it was heading into Vegas. I can't imagine too many people know much about that story, but
no, I can
share.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was that was one of the kind of the career highlights of that. So, first of all, I have to stress to people listening, it wasn't my private jet, and wasn't the initial plan to be on the private jet. But a lot of journalism is about kind of planning ahead of time events and interview opportunities. And 2023 was when Ricciardo had come back with AlphaTauri, as they were known then. He'd had that little spell on the sidelines when he broke his hand, and he'd come back. And I've always had a really good relationship with Ricciardo and with the guys that work around him. So we always tried to get interviews and stuff with him, and we were like, let's do a great big sit down interview. And they said, well, actually, what he's doing is this thing called the Gran Toro, which is he's flying out to Death Valley on the I forget because of the weird Vegas schedule. It would have been on the Wednesday, which is media day. Usually media day is Thursday. He's flying out there on Wednesday morning, and then driving these really cool Hondas and sports cars and stuff from there with a bunch of influencers and a few other journalists to Vegas. And you can get a bit of time in the car with them. And I was like, yeah, that's great. Fantastic. And we had it all planned out. And because I was there with ESPN, we had a little team of people. And at the very last minute, I say we as ESPN, the royal we. As an Englishman, I think I can use the royal we. We suddenly got a Lewis Hamilton interview very late on. And that's kind of how media works. It's something like you've got 5 minutes with Lewis, but it's 5 blocks away, and you've got to get there. So suddenly the cameraman that was my cameraman for that the other part of that journey, but also was going to be my driver, was suddenly like, I've got to go do Lewis. People will hate saying this, but you do prioritize your Max, your Lewis, your Fernandos. You just end up prioritizing those over a lot of other people. Even by then, Ricciardo. So I was like, well, do I get an Uber to Death Valley? It sounds like the beginning of a true crime documentary. So I thought, let's not do that. And I spoke to my producer, and we'd made the decision, if I can't get there, we probably can't do it for safety reasons. So I called Red Bull up, and I just said, look, I can't make it. Something's come up. And I've got a name check. I mean, we actually watched baseball with Paul Smith from Red Bull last year in Red Bull. So he's head of comms at Red Bull. Really, really good guy. and he replied to me. He said, "Oh, hang on, I'll text you." He said, "I need to know your weight, your date of birth, and there was something else, your full name, I think it was, something like that." And I was like, okay. So I sent it back to him, and I was thinking, what could that be? And then he said, "I'm going to get you on the PJ with Ricciardo and his manager Blake." And I was like, okay. And he's like, "Yeah, you're in." And and then the next day I met them at their hotel. We drove to this kind of little airstrip in Vegas, and so it was me, Blake, who's Daniel Ricciardo's manager / agent, and Ricciardo. And so it was completely bizarre. We took off, went over there was a few pictures. He has that Daniel Ricciardo photo account, doesn't he?
He does .jpeg or whatever it is.
Yeah, that's it, .jpeg. And he took a few of those photos when I was there. He actually took a few photos of me, and I'm gutted that I'd never asked. I meant to ask him to send them to me, just how I'd love to have them. I never did. But it's actually one of the best things, because we weren't recording that. I said to him, "Look, don't worry about it. I won't record us in the private jet." Had a lot of the valuable time you get with drivers is actually the stuff away from the camera. You get kind of human interactions with them, and you're not just like, "Hey, I'm going to ask you 8 questions about Formula One." And he was actually asking me a lot of stuff. He was asking me, similar to how we started this pod, tell me about your career, but also where'd you go to school. We've always known each other in quite in a pretty good way, but it's always in a I'm a journalist asking him about stuff kind of way. So it was very cool. And then when we landed, just to finish, so I don't mean the story to be so long, but we then landed in Death Valley, and we expected Red Bull, there'd be someone there to pick us up, and there was no one there. So we got out of the plane, and the plane kind of eventually took off like 5 minutes later, and we were looking around like, there's no one here. We're in the middle of, and no signal on our phones. So we're like, what on earth are we doing here? And I remember I've joked to him about this months later. I was like, if we die here, the headline's going to be like, Ricciardo dies in Death Valley. I'll be like the 8th paragraph down. I won't even be in the story, really. So I remember that. But it was fine, because the convoy was just a bit late picking us up, and they got us, and then we went and did it. And then, annoyingly, to kind of make this a bittersweet story, when we set the GoPros up in the car for the interview, they stopped working. Little did I know, we had a great interview in the car, one of the best I've ever done. And the interview was lost forever. So it's kind of a weird, experience in that sense. But yeah, so you're very lucky in moments like that to kind of get to experience those things. And ultimately they help you build a rapport with a driver that I think is quite important to have, just generally.
I mean, I'm sure you've got still so many good tidbits, regardless of whether the recording came through or not.
Oh yeah, massively. And it's like part of me was like, if only I hadn't been taught so much about the integrity of quotes, I could have made up from memory, not made up, but like been like, this is roughly what he said, because there were some really good bits. But I was like, that's not doing him any, that's not the right thing to do, obviously. But I was like, man, it was that good that the thought did cross my mind at one point, very, very briefly, and then I was like, no. None of that. I was taught too well for to do that.
Funny, you joke that you're asking a driver 8 questions about Formula One, and I'm doing exactly that to you right now. But
no, but it's great. But I mean, it's part of the job, right? And the good thing, I think, the good thing with being in the sport as long as I have been now, is that if I see a driver, not all of them, because some of them just you either don't strike a bond with, or they might not be the biggest fan of you, or they might just not. They might just not have an opinion of you. There's a few that you stop and say, "Hey, how you doing?" They're like, "Yeah, how are you?" It's very front end stuff, and I don't think you can ever assume you're best mates with someone. I don't think it's a good idea to be when you're reporting on people. But yeah, it's a nice thing to have. So definitely one of the kind of the perks of the job is to have that nice rapport with people.
Yeah. I mean, relationships are all about getting a personal aspect to things you write about.
And that's honestly, that's kind of where I think journalism is kind of in an interesting place, kind of just generally, not away from sports and in sports, but it's where sometimes the frustration can be with, the amount of times you write a story and you've got a source in there, and you're like, the source is like the driver's dad, or or the driver told you off record, or then I just don't name me. Not always, but sometimes. And then your comments like, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about, and you're like, I wish. Because journalism, the ethics of journalism are you don't name your source, right? Because it makes people willing to speak to you, off. We say off record or on background. But you're sometimes like, man, I just wish I could like just say who this is, because it would make it a lot easier.
Not plucking it out of the air, for sure.
Yeah, and it's. I don't want to, and there's a lot of people who cover F1 because they love it, but there's a lot of stories you see, and you're like, man, like all this would have taken would have been a text message to this driver or team to stand it up or to knock it down. And I'm a little bit worried in some aspects that's getting lost a little bit, you know, and not just in Formula One. I think just generally, you know, it's becoming way easier just to report anything you want to report, which is a shame.
Exactly. I definitely think it's becoming more and more commonplace these days, certainly in the Twitterverse and on Instagram. The kind of crap you read is just like people making things up to get a click. So, you know, I do want to, talking about reputable journalism and stories you've written lately, the one that really stood out to me, and I'll link this down in the video description, is one you published on ESPN recently about storylines for the upcoming F1 season. I think a lot of people are really curious to get your spin on that because it is getting closer and closer. This video will go out just before testing, so I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about right after that weekend. You talked about, you know, the winners, the rookies, the people in with a shot of, you know, making some steps forward in this season. You know, I'd love to start at the top with kind of your take on who you think's kind of the front runner for 2025. I think we saw a couple of surprises last season. Obviously, McLaren, you know, made a really good stride forward from about Imola last year, or since Lando won in Miami, and Red Bull seemed to have lost a bit of talent in that respect and technical acumen. Kind of what's your read on it initially? Because, you know, we had multiple race winners last year and 1 year out from the new regs. So I imagine there's probably going to be a bit of change in 2025 as well.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest thing to look forward to is those multiple winners. I'm hoping that's the same again this year. You know, I think the only thing that really, I don't want to say ruined last year, because actually I think we were treated to a really special title victory from Max. You know, the kind of the blueprint of how to win when your car gets away from you through the season. But the one thing missing was that Max was so far ahead, the championship never felt truly alive in the drivers anyway. And so you had all these winners, and it was like Max, to his credit, was just you know, was keeping that points gap at the top, you know, alive. So I think we're going to have a really close season again. I mean, I don't know about you, but I felt that the Red Bull implosion was maybe a little bit overplayed last year. I think it was exacerbated by Perez being as bad as he was. I think that it's such a shame because Sergio Perez, I think, is a very good driver. You know, he had a long time when everyone said Perez deserves a front-running seat, and he got one, and then, you know, he won a handful of races, but he had to go against Max Verstappen. But I think that made it look a lot worse in terms of where they were at. You know, there was that spell in the middle of the year where they were really bad. I can't see that being as extreme again. I think that, you know, Newey leaving is one thing, but a lot of people you talk to at Red Bull will say, we're bigger than just one man. You know, we're not just the sum of Adrian Newey's brain. Like, he's obviously led them in a really great path for a long time, but a lot of the guys under him have not just come in, they've also learned under him as well. So, you know, there's a bit of that going on. So I think you've got to consider Max a favourite, just because if he's got a car that's even remotely close to the front right now, he's going to be up there because he's just so damn good. But obviously as well, McLaren, to that point that you made about, you know, the slow start, the key for the season, in my opinion, is if McLaren can start Bahrain well, then I think they
Australia.
Yeah, exactly. It's because Bahrain, like,
true, the testing, of course.
Oh, sorry, you're right. I've just literally booked my Australia flight, so I should remember that's the opener. They're actually kind of lucky this time because Bahrain has traditionally been a really tough circuit for them. They've always really struggled there. Yeah, like for a long time. So I think that obviously they'll still have to go to Bahrain. I think it's the fifth race, or it's after Japan. But it means Australia, if they can come out of the gate there with a win, immediately colour their season like that. So that's exciting. And then obviously we have Lewis at Ferrari, which, I mean, I'm super excited about. And it's just, there's just stories all over the place. You've got Antonelli coming in. You know, you've got kind of the you know, I'm sure you're very interested in it as well with the Jack Doohan situation and how many races he'll get. And then we're in this kind of golden era as well of Formula One with all these rookies coming in, all these young drivers, and you know, the level of talent is just amazing. I mean, I remember, to go back to the point of when I started out in 2014, the grid would have been 20 drivers, and I would have said 4 or 5 were like pay drivers. You know, it was like this guy is just paying for a seat. There's no two ways about it. You know, there was Max Chilton, who's a British driver. You know, not a bad racing driver. You know, has gone and had a decent career in IndyCar, but you know, wouldn't have been in Formula One on pure talent alone. So there's a lot of that, and now we just don't have it. So we're in a really, really fortunate place in Formula One across the board. We have great stories, great champions, great personalities, and just this whole new generation of talent coming through. And it's hard to say who the best one is because, you know, there's so many exciting guys about to come through.
Yeah, I'd love to kind of get your take on the rookies and the new crop of talent in just a second. And I think there's also a piece for Ferrari later in the video, and we'll
Yeah,
talk about your book as well. I think,
absolutely.
we saw a lot from Lando last year, and Max as well. We know how good he is. I think, with Lewis Hamilton joining Ferrari, even though I wouldn't say Charles Leclerc has flown under the radar, I feel as though there's so many more headlines around who could win the drivers that Charles, I think, is maybe not unfairly dismissed, but I feel as though he's in with a much better chance than people give him credit for at the moment.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think actually, if you do a deep dive into last season, if you go from the summer break to the end of the year, I think there's a very good argument to be made that Charles Leclerc was the best driver in Formula One in terms of form. He obviously won in Monza. He won in Austin. He and Sainz came back with that win in Mexico as well. But the two of them really put the pressure on McLaren at the end of the season. So I think you're right. And I mean, that whole Ferrari situation is, to me, I think it's great for Formula One because everyone's got a different take on it, right? And a lot of it's going to be based on which Lewis Hamilton do you think they're getting? Do you think they're getting the Lewis Hamilton that, we saw in 2021, hungry, fired up, ready to race wheel to wheel with people? Or are we getting that Lewis of the last few years that maybe looks a little bit off? Either way, I think we're going to learn a lot about Charles Leclerc in the next few years because, certainly this season, but obviously Lewis is there, barring some absolute catastrophe. He's there for a few seasons. So I think you're right. I think Ferrari have brought Lewis in because I think Ferrari always want to have superstar drivers and maybe moved away from that ethos a little bit in the last couple of seasons. And suddenly you've got the situation where we can now measure Charles Leclerc against Lewis Hamilton. And he'll either sink or swim. So I think we'll know. And personally, I mean, I think Charles is probably the best qualifier in Formula One now. If you look at his one lap pace, his biggest issue has always been his peaks are so high, but he can sometimes just be a bit anonymous. There can be races where suddenly you're like, oh, Charles is really nowhere here. It's not that often now, but it does still happen. So, yeah, and if he can raise his game with Lewis there, and conversely, if Lewis can raise his game with this mega talent next to him as well, then I think we're just going to be in for such a treat this season. But yeah, I think you're right. I think either of those guys can win the title. My fear for Ferrari is they both take points off each other through the season.
Yeah.
So I think Ferrari actually would be my pick for the constructors this year because of that lineup. But I think then the drawback of that will be there'll be moments when you're like, damn, if Lewis was winning this race instead of Charles, it would be better, or vice versa, because he'd take more points out of the leader, So, but we'll see how it plays out because Ferrari could come out of the gate and have the best car by a comfortable margin.
Well, it's quite funny because they are quite a contrast, Lewis and Charles, because we know how good on Saturdays Charles is with that single lap pace, and that's been Lewis's kryptonite for what feels like the last couple of seasons on Saturday, but can string together a very good drive. We saw that even in Abu Dhabi to come all the way back to fourth on the Sunday. So I'm curious if we get a Lewis Hamilton on Saturday that's kind of more of what we saw in 2021 and before that, and if he can lift his Saturday, then I think that sets him up and Ferrari up for a really good run at the title for both.
Yeah, I think so. And that will be key. I think, mate, that is a really astute observation because last year when Ferrari had that resurgence, remember they had that upgrade in Spain that didn't go the right way. They kind of lost their way a little bit and they were like, I'm not sure if this is, and they were upset with that because obviously McLaren's upgrade had vaulted them to the front. Ferrari bought this upgrade and they didn't really seem to make any progress. Over the summer break, they made a lot of tweaks to procedures, to setups, etc. And what they found by the end of the year was they now, for the first time in a long time, they have a car that is very good on Saturdays, but is actually strongest on Sundays. It always used to be the other way around, and that's where the drivers were having to overdrive. There was more pressure on the strategy team to kind of get them out of that. So I think if Charles is qualifying well, and then the car is still a Sunday car, he's in a great position, and that will be big. Like if he's beating Lewis in qualifying, we know, don't we, that in Formula One, the lead driver on track usually gets the better strategy. That's just the natural way of things. And I don't think Ferrari don't have a number 1 and 2 driver. There's no way either of those guys would accept being the number 2 contractually. Way. So it'll be really big because if you're 20 laps into a race and Charles is leading by 10 seconds and Lewis is second, suddenly you're like, well, Lewis's role now is to protect Charles's win. That's always been the way, and vice versa. So there's just going to be so much of that this season. And personally, how Ferrari react to that is an amazing thing to think about because they've always nailed that. So
Yeah.
there's just so many little bits to it that we'll see as it goes on. But yeah, there's just so many areas that it could be exciting, and so many areas where it could turn into a really weird situation very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I want to get into Ferrari in your book a little bit later, so I'm not going to spoil all of the questions I have for you on that in just a second. But it's funny because Charles obviously been around for several years now. He still, to me, seems like a very green, like 21-year-old on the scene, but he's been around the rodeo a few times and had, in my opinion, his most complete season with Ferrari last year. So, I mean, kind of on the topic of young drivers in the sport, you mentioned, obviously, that golden era of Max, Lando, Lewis, Fernando Alonso, and then the talent we've got coming through, 6 drivers under the age of 23. All of them, 6 if you include Lawson as rookies in that category as well. And, your piece on ESPN recently was really fascinating to me. They've all got, their own little strengths and things we as viewers and pundits can look out for this season. Kind of give me the rundown on a couple of them, all of them. I don't really mind. I think there's a lot of attention drawn to maybe the Kimmis and the Behrmans of the world, but I don't think that necessarily means we should be overlooking maybe Hadjar or Bortoleto just because they're in a smaller team.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think that's kind of where Formula One's always been the same way. Is that the guy under the most pressure this year, rookies wise, is Antonelli, and then if we consider Lawson a rookie, which. Technically, and I do actually, because he's having a rookie season, it's a loose one because to most people he won't be a rookie at all. But for all intents and purposes, he is one. So he's under a lot of pressure. But yeah, Kimi's under a load there. Replacing Lewis and going into that Mercedes team, I think he'll be very up and down. I mean, Toto Wolff has said he'd rather slow down a driver who's too fast than speed up a driver that isn't fast enough. You can rein in a driver like Kimi Antonelli, and that's why the Italian media is so excited about him. They have been for years. They think they've got an absolute superstar on their hands. I think they're gutted that he ended up driving for Mercedes and not for Ferrari. Right. But to me, that actually adds a really great element to the story because at one point he may be going up against Ferrari, who knows, for titles and for victories. So he's great. But yeah, I want to highlight one name that I'm actually really excited about, and I think a lot of people should be, is Bortoleto. And I don't think we're going to see a lot from him this year because he's at Sauber. Obviously, they're about to become Audi, so there's a lot of attention off track on for Sauber. But Bortoleto won Formula 2 last year. He beat Isaac Hadjar, who's now obviously replaced Lawson at RB. But Bortoleto came through the Fernando Alonso karting academy. And in Abu Dhabi last year at the end, when we were just, when you have these end of season interviews with these drivers, you do ask them quite wide-ranging questions, usually because you're like, we need some Christmas content here, we need some stuff to fill the next 3 weeks or whatever it is. And Fernando started talking about Bortoleto, and he said he's easily the best rookie coming through. Now, maybe he's contractually obliged to say that. He is trying to promote his own karting academy, but at the same time, he's not the only person in Formula One who thinks that. He's one of a number of people who are very excited about how good he is. Bortoleto was actually at McLaren. He was on their junior books. And Sauber Sauber and Audi, I think, have effectively bought him off of them. So he's a really exciting talent, but weirdly, I don't think we'll see much from him. And he might look a bit anonymous in his first year because it's so difficult to make an impression at the back of the field. But yeah, I'm excited for him. And to be honest with you, I'm excited for all of them. I'm really concerned for Doohan. I think he's in a really kind of bad situation there because, let's face it, from everything I've heard, it does seem very likely that Alpine will try and put Colapinto in sooner rather than later. And you just can't do much with a handful of races. But that's Formula One, and that's Flavio Briatore, who Alpine brought back. That's always been his MO, is like, if you don't perform, you're out. There's no sentiment there at all. So he's probably the guy you fear for the most going into this season for that reason. But yeah, it's just great to see so many young guys coming in, fresh faces.
I mean, I won't talk about Jack too much because it does feel like he's got a guillotine over his head. But it's funny though. His manager is also Briatore, and
yeah, right.
Then they've obviously signed Franco for 5 years. Was it? What his manager was saying. I mean, I again, that's just kind of what we're reading on Twitter. I'm not sure how much truth there is. So, but if
my understanding is it's a 2-year deal, and then there's options for extra ones. But then, his manager's very outspoken person, which works. I think it works for Colapinto. But yeah, 5. I don't think anyone in Formula 1 would ever sign a 5-year deal without any escape clause in it because you never know if a team's going to exist in 5 years or if it's going to be sold or whatever. So there's that. But yeah, I mean, sorry, you were saying about Colapinto.
Oh no, I think it's just like Jack's unfortunately kind of a bit set up for failure here because he's got half a dozen races, and like what does he have to do to stay beyond that? I mean, even if he does beat Gasly in a car that was for the most part of last season a bit of a back marker until they got those upgrades in the last quarter of 2024. Does he have to beat Gasly? Does he have to get the points every single race? Or is it essentially, even if Jack does end up in the top 6, top 7 in the odd race or two, that may not just be enough either way?
Yeah, my take or my reading of it is that the race he had in Abu Dhabi was actually very important. And to be fair, he acquitted himself really well in that race. He didn't, he wasn't miles off the pace. But I think there's always been a feeling at Alpine that since Piastri was, Piastri should have been the face of that team.
Truly.
They bungled that completely, and then since then, there's been a real feeling of we need to promote youth up. Whenever it comes, and Doohan doesn't have the same level of hype and excitement that there was around Piastri. I think he's a good driver. I'm not sure if he's at the same level. I really think Piastri's one of the. I think he could be the best driver in Formula One in a few years, in my opinion. He's from what I've heard from people at McLaren, they think that as well. So Doohan got the seat in a head-to-head test with Mick Schumacher. Now, when Mick Schumacher was signed to Alpine, they put him in the WEC program. I think they were impressed with him, but a lot of people in Formula One think that Mick Schumacher probably has had more opportunities than he maybe deserved in terms of talent. It's a harsh thing to say, but I think the surname it's hindered him, but it's also helped. There's been a people have wanted that story to be true, and that's actually weirdly hampered Doohan because he beat Schumacher. A lot of people around the team and a lot of people in the team were like, well, is that impressive? And it does, Doohan doesn't choose who the benchmark is, but I think that's been held over him as well. And also he's had so many private tests, and he had the Formula One outing. He's had some FP2, some FP1 appearances. So I think Briatore and Oliver Oakes, the team boss, were like, well, he should be able to get in there and perform at a good level. And I think he did. I think from what I heard, they were impressed with him in Abu Dhabi. The problem is, if he's not spectacular, I think he's up against it, because I think the prevailing consensus is that Colapinto. I think Colapinto's a bit like Kimi Antonelli. I think his highs are going to be super, super high, but you're going to have some races where the guy just like in it wasn't Saudi, was it? It was Vegas, where he just clips the inside wall, has a crash, kind of out of nowhere, pushing way too hard. But teams do prefer that. They're like, if we can rein that side of him in. Look at Max Verstappen when he started. Was very erratic, and obviously now we have this maybe not so polished article, but a much more polished article in Max. So I do feel for Doohan. He's kind of a victim of circumstance and kind of the wave of history. But we'll see. I mean, if he does go out and absolutely smashes it in Australia, Alpine's suddenly in a very difficult position, because it's very difficult to get rid of someone if they're performing well. So we'll see what happens. My hunch is by Miami we'll have Colapinto in, which in itself is kind of a fun story. But yeah, it's harsh whenever a driver has to make way for that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think the hype after the first 3 or 4 races at Williams last year for Franco was kind of put him on the radar. I almost think Alpine had kind of been backed into a position where they'd already kind of signed Jack up. So I mean, if they'd given themselves a bit more time, maybe they would have.
Yeah, and I never really understood their decision there, because Doohan wasn't going anywhere else. No. Doohan was their guy. So yeah, I think you're absolutely spot on, because sometimes teams get put under a lot of pressure by sponsors and fans, especially when you're announcing something. It's like, well, if it's your young driver, and especially if he's not talking to anyone else, at one point, I think the only seat that wasn't sure was Perez's. It's like, with all due respect, Red Bull aren't signing Jack Doohan. They're not signing him. So you could have waited for it, and I think that you're right. They kind of ended up in a situation where they confirmed Doohan, and then they probably kind of had a bit of buyer's remorse a little bit later. But yeah, that's the way it goes. Yeah.
Now, a team that I don't think had any buyer's remorse is Ferrari signing Lewis Hamilton 12 months ago. I think the 12-month anniversary was a couple of days ago or so.
It was. It was February the 1st, yeah.
Yeah, and so, I think that's understandably been the biggest headline in Formula One this off-season, all of the photo shoots and the content and media around that. And I think it's, in my opinion, going to be, and understandably so, the biggest headline heading into Australia. Lewis Hamilton at Ferrari, Australia back on the calendar as the first race of the season. I think there's
Which is
so
how it
much.
should. Which is how it should
Yeah.
be, by the way, for me. I mean, yeah, Australia is the opening race. Is F1 is right when that's the case. Sorry, mate. Carry on.
No, no, no. You're
I
right.
just had to put that on record because I love
It's
Melbourne
great.
as a place. So fun.
Best
Such a
time of
fun
year as
venue.
well.
Yeah,
Yeah. No.
venue's great. The people are just having so much fun, and it's always dramatic. It's always got an element of like this something's going to happen here. So I love it.
Yeah, I think there's so many storylines we can hang our hat on and see or hope for in the first race of the year. Now I think Lewis, there's going to be a lot of expectation regardless of how long it might take for him to bed into the team. But I think for me, the expectation also stems from the tifosi and that kind of energy that comes from their supporters. And I think the photos we saw coming out of Maranello a few weeks ago, or a couple of weeks ago now, it's just very exciting. I think it's an exciting time to be a Ferrari fan and someone that covers Ferrari such as yourself. And does that kind of anticipation, the expectation for the team, for Lewis, does that last all season? Is it as soon as we get to Australia or after Australia subside, or is it going to ebb and flow depending on kind of where we're at in the season and how the team does?
I think it'll be all season, and I think this is kind of a perfect cocktail of stuff for Formula One. You've got Lewis and Ferrari. And for me, I mean, growing up, I was a Ferrari fan, and it's just always meant a lot more to me than... I mean, even growing up in the UK, I've always had immense respect for Williams and McLaren and the English teams, but there was just something about Ferrari. I think because they weren't English and because they were a team that kind of operated on their own, in their own sphere, I absolutely loved them. So I think that hype will always be there. And just on your point about the first race, what's fascinating, if you go back through history, there's so many drivers who actually won their debut race for Ferrari. So Fernando Alonso did, Kimi Räikkönen did, Nigel Mansell did, Mario Andretti did, Juan Manuel Fangio did. Vettel won his second race with Ferrari. He didn't quite win the first, but he won the second one. Charles Leclerc should have won his second race for Ferrari, and then he had an engine failure towards the end of the race. So there's precedent there for winning your first. And so I think that, I don't think Schumacher was his second or third as well. So there's a history here of great drivers going to Ferrari and immediately making their mark. And so the idea that Lewis can do it, I think, is not far-fetched at all. It's written into the history of that team, and he will be going there knowing that and wanting to replicate it. So easy to get excited. And just to, you mentioned it already about the fact I've just written a Ferrari book, but the 12-year anniversary was significant because on the 30th of January last year, I was talking to different publishers about this Ferrari book idea I had, and they were like, "We'd love to do it. We love Ferrari, great idea, but let's think of a hook. Let's think of a way in with it." And I was like, "Well, let's look at the title drought and how they can win again." Was kind of the book. And then 12 hours later, my phone starts buzzing. People saying, "I think Lewis is going to Ferrari." Write the story. Everyone's writing the story, and then the publishers by the end of the day are like, "I think we found the hook." So it's like but that's a good kind of, it's a microcosm of what it's done to the average person. It's suddenly made people sit up and go, "Oh wow, Lewis to Ferrari." That means something to a lot of people. That even though we all love, let's say, Carlos Sainz at Ferrari, people go, "Okay, that's still big." But Lewis going there, Fernando going back there, Max going there one day maybe, they would all resonate in a way that I think a few other moves do. So I'm super excited, and I'd be surprised if the hype dies out, unless Lewis just isn't very good there. And I
Can't see that happening.
Yeah, Lewis is a legend of the sport, one of the all-time greats. It's hard to see him doing that, and but yeah, we'll see. I'm certainly going to be excited about it all year. Maybe I'll be boring people to death with it by Miami, but I think most people are in the same camp as me and yourself.
I don't think so. I think it's such a nice cross section of a generational driver, one of the best drivers of all time in the sport. Signing up to the greatest team in the sport, the longest team in the sport. So. And
I've had a few comments on Twitter, people being like, "Why do you guys keep talking about Lewis to Ferrari?" It's like, well, it is just a bit. You don't get stories like that all the time in Formula One. You just don't. It's kind of two absolutely legendary parts of the history coming together. And also for people remembering, my first year when Vettel went there, it was exactly the same. It was exactly the same level of hype. That was 9 months into my first job, with ESPN covering Formula One. So yeah, it's exactly the same. When a big name champion goes there, it's big. But I think the Lewis one was bigger than Vettel even because 7 championships. He could pass Schumacher in the Ferrari, which is would be a perfect kind of bit to his story as well. But also he could be beaten by Charles to it. There's just levels to it that Hollywood scriptwriters would love all of them to come together, and we've got them just in front of our eyes, just developing all year. So
it's all that numerology as well around. I'm seeing something new every single day on Twitter or Instagram that it's the 16th time Lewis and Charles are on the podium is going to be Charles' 44th podium or something like that. And
honestly,
there's just so many different connections, and people can just think of anything off the top of their head to make the Ferrari hype even bigger, right?
No, some of the stats people find across sports is amazing. I mean, some of the ones in the NFL, when people say, when it's been, when the gusts of wind have been like 33 miles an hour, this kicker is 25%, and you're like, what on it? Whose stat is that? Like, where'd that come? But I love them. Long may they continue.
It's. I think it's sometimes cherry picking, but it also makes for a really good storyline heading into
absolutely does
as well. So
absolutely.
you mentioned your book coming out in March this year, Forza Ferrari. I don't know how many people know about it. I'm particularly excited to read it when it becomes available. Do you want to share a bit more about it? I think the synopsis of it covers those pivotal shifts in the team the last few decades, their dominance from the Schumacher days all the way to the challenges they've faced in the last few years, and now obviously securing Lewis's signature on a multi-year contract. Do you want to kind of share with everyone what it's about?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so the full title is Forza Ferrari is the main title, which Forza is kind of the Italian for come on. Like, they use it for the football, they use it for Ferrari, and you'll hear it whenever you go to Monza all the time. The Italians clinging off a fence or whatever, shouting that. But the subhead, I think, is the important bit. Is how does F1's greatest team win again? And it is really the story of kind of from Enzo Ferrari's death in 1988 through to now, how the team kind of went from really being in a rough place, really, really being in the doldrums of, is this team going to continue? Is it ever going to win championships again? Luca de Montezemolo, who I'm really excited for new fans to kind of, if they read this book, to be introduced to him, because when I was growing up, he was the president of Ferrari. And now, even though we do see John Elkann around from time to time, he's not the looming presence that de Montezemolo was. And de Montezemolo built this super team with Jean Todt as the team boss, Michael Schumacher as driver. So the book looks at that era, how that came together, how it then fell away, in the late 2000s and early 2010s, the mistakes that have been made, but also the way Formula One has shifted and changed has kind of hurt Ferrari, because back then there was no budget cap. Ferrari could just spend all the money they wanted. We've seen the images recently of Lewis at Fiorano, which is the test track that Ferrari owns right around or just next to Enzo Ferrari's house. They used to just be able to go there and just test all day. Schumacher would turn up on a Monday after a race and be like, right, let's do 3 days of testing and then we'll go to the next race. They're capped now with testing. You can't do so much. So a lot of things have changed that have said that domination Ferrari had has kind of fallen away, and Ferrari made some mistakes. There's some near misses with Fernando. That there's one chapter on Abu Dhabi 2010, which is where Fernando Alonso and Ferrari just kind of Fernando lost the championship based on a strategy call that meant he spent a whole race behind a Renault, much to his chagrin. He was as you would be. So it's just charting that history, and then obviously, like you said, it gets to the end where we've got the Fred Vasseur team, we've got Lewis coming in, and looking at Charles. I mean, I spoke to Mattia Binotto, I spoke to Gunther Steiner, Stefano Domenicali, who obviously now is the head of F1. Was Ferrari team boss for a long time, and actually oversaw. He didn't oversee any championships as team boss, but he had 3 near misses at the final race, which were each pretty agonizing. So, spoke to a lot of people, including de Montezemolo, who very kindly did the foreword for the book, which is great. So, a real nice collection of names. There's some quotes from Carlos and Charles from this past couple of seasons in there as well. And yeah, I hope it just tells a nice story of kind of how the modern team got to where they are right now. Because I think a lot of fans came in 2019, 2020, 2021, which is great. There's been so many who have come in. But I think a lot of them have heard over and over again, this great team, this historic team, this great team. And actually, it's always, I mean, I was the same when I came into NFL. You'd always hear it about the Pittsburgh Steelers or the Dallas Cowboys. And then you actually start reading about it, and you're like, wow, this is unbelievable. And then you think, especially in the case of like Dallas, for example, you're like, how did they end up where they are now, where they're not winning anything? And I think Ferrari's got a very similar story to that. So hopefully it shines a bit of a light on that. And yeah, I mean, I massively enjoyed writing it. And I've got to say that title gave me a lot of headaches, because I was like, if they win the Constructors' Championship, we can't call it how F1's greatest team win again. And I kind of wanted them to win it from the fan in me point of view, but from a professional point of view, I was like, right, if we can get McLaren winning it this year, that would be great, and then we can get Ferrari next year. So that worked out fine, and yeah, and I mean it's available on Amazon, so it's out at the beginning of March in the UK. It's a few weeks later in North America, but it's available for pre-order now on Amazon. So if you type in if you just type in Forza Ferrari, a load of Lego shows up. So you've got to type in Forza Ferrari and Nate Saunders, or the full title, How F1's Greatest Team Win Again.
I actually had that.
Yeah,
I had that. I tried to search Forza Ferrari. I was like, I don't need Lego right now.
I was like, I can't compete against Lego. So, and it's available on Google Books, and I mean, in North America, it's going to be in a bunch of places, good, different bookstores and stuff like that. So keep your eyes out for it. And I'm going to be, if you follow me on socials, you can unfollow me if you want, because I'm going to be plugging it pretty hard over the next couple of weeks when it gets printed on Monday. So it'll be an official book as of Monday, and then the release is the following month. So yeah, mate, super excited about it, and mate, I mean, I'm excited for you to read it as well. It's a nice thing to for people to read your stuff in that way, so
great, mate.
We'll see.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. As I said, it's going to be a great read, and I do think it will shed a light and I guess another perspective on Ferrari that probably a lot of people don't have. You obviously mentioned you'd spoken to a lot of kind of team principals in the paddock and that have had proximity to Ferrari over the years, De Montezemolo, Domenicali, Steiner. Was there anyone in particular you found particularly difficult to track down? Anyone that you tried to squeeze a quote out of or wanted to but couldn't?
So I tried to I spent a long time trying to get Sebastian Fernando, and what you find with a lot of drivers is very reluctant to give bespoke quotes to a book that isn't their own. I think a lot of them realize they've got a story to tell, but they want to tell it in their own book, which is totally understandable. So don't think that there's no quotes from those guys in there. There's plenty from different press conferences and through time, but tracking those guys down was tricky. But that's what was quite nice about it, was tracking down people around the team, people that are kind of on the periphery. And in terms of tracking people down difficultly, no, honestly, because as soon as I started talking to one person, they would mention to someone else and say, oh yeah, if Nate gets in touch, you should talk to him. There's a great. I want to shout out one person who won't be known to Formula One fans, but I think was fantastic for it, was Chris Dyer, who I mentioned the Abu Dhabi 2010 chapter. He was the head of strategy for that, and was blamed. I mean, he got sacked at the end of that race, but he's very frank and open about that. And the quotes for that. I mean, that chapter was one of my favorites to write. And also spoke to Iñaki Rueda, who was the strategy boss under Binotto, who was oversaw a lot of that infamous stay out thing in Monaco with Charles. That wasn't his voice, but it was his strategy team. So he explains a lot of that, and I thought it was nice for him to kind of get to and he was very open. I mean, he kind of went in all guns blazing and was like, you could tell he as much as he loved Ferrari, I don't think he had had a great deal of fond memories for a lot of the people he worked with there. So that stuff like that's great, and I think that hopefully there's a lot of stuff people just haven't read before in there. There'll be some stuff you do read and you think I've heard this before, but yeah, I think there's plenty of stuff for people to get their teeth stuck into.
Beauty, man.
And so we'll see. And I mean, yeah, I'm super excited for people to read it.
I'll make sure to plug the link for the Amazon book down in the description below as well. So if anyone wants to check that out, be sure to do so.
And if you want some Lego, obviously just type in Forza Ferrari and you'll get. I mean, it looks like a great set. I was looking at it, just to see how easy it was to find the book.
Oh, well, that's good. The SEO's definitely working, mate.
Yeah. Well, we need to work on the SEO a little bit, maybe. But if I'd known, I'd have called it a different name.
Well, that's great, mate. Thank you for walking me through that and sharing.
No, absolutely.
That piece of what you've been working on the last year or two. Right before we wrap up, I'm doing this with every guest I'm getting on the channel this year, and I know most of the recent interviews and fireside chats will be before or around preseason testing. So a very limited view on how the teams and drivers are going to perform this year. But if I could get your way too early top three in the drivers and your constructors winner,
love that.
I'd love to get that.
Okay, so I'll tell you what, I'll start with constructors first. So I mentioned it earlier. I think Ferrari will win the constructors. I just think that we haven't really talked about McLaren. It hasn't come up in the right way. But I've got a feeling I just don't think McLaren are going to be able to deal with that as well as Ferrari will deal with Lewis and Charles. Piastri just like I mentioned earlier, I'm such a big fan of Piastri. I'm a big fan of Lando Norris as well. Actually, I think they're both incredible talents. McLaren didn't seem very good at dealing with that situation last year. So the reason I'm saying all that is because I think Ferrari can beat McLaren to the championship, and I'd put Red Bull third again because I think we know how good Max is, but I think Lawson will be better than Perez, but I can see him having some rough races where he's maybe not in there. In terms of the championship, I mean, this is the thing doing it before testing, like you alluded to. It's great as well because you can almost look at your predictions 2 weeks later and say, "Wow, I don't know if I back myself there now." But I feel like I think one of the McLaren drivers will win the title, and I can't work out which one. It's such a tough one this year, and this is where we're so lucky in Formula One right now. Is that I'm not trying to sit on the fence just for the sake of it. Like, this is a genuinely difficult one to call, but for the sake of time, because I don't want to take all of your evening up while I think about it. I would say Lando first. I can't, because you've got to put Max in there, haven't you? You've got to put Max in the top three.
Yeah,
like,
you have to.
I know that the stereotype is that every British journalist hates Max Verstappen, but like it's not
generational.
True. He's generational. He's in my opinion, he's the best driver in Formula One right now, and so I think you'd put. See, now I'm second guessing because I'm not sure whether I do think Lando would beat Max in a straight fight. I just don't know if Lando wouldn't do what Lewis would do in 20 or did do in 21, where he was like, if you want to get past me, you're going to have to overtake me, or you're going to have to yield, which is ultimately what we've realised now people have to do. Actually, you know what? I'm going to flip it around. I'm going to flip it around completely and give a very unpopular answer and say Max wins the title, Charles Leclerc second, Lando Norris third, and Lewis in fourth.
That's interesting because you made a great point about Piastri potentially also. Both McLaren drivers could both win the championship, and then
and he's not even in the top four. Yeah. I think that the one thing on Piastri is he is still finding that consistency. In the same way as Lando. But yeah, man. I mean,
to be fair, his time management was much better last year than it was in 2023. I think.
Yeah,
he made a lot of
and that was only his second season. So yeah, I'm already hating my top three. So because Piastri's not there. So actually, you know what? Let's have some fun with it. I'll say Max, Piastri, Leclerc. I think that would be an incredible season storyline wise. And also, it means I've picked three non-Brits, and I can put the British bias stereotype right in the bin because I really hate that. Like, I hate how lazy that is as a trope because it's not true. And hopefully, people listening to this realize, like, you just respect whichever driver's great, right, in the field. But yeah, if we had that season, or even if Piastri beat Max, or if Charles beat both of them, you imagine the different stories of that. And also, Max winning a fifth title, given all the moves at other teams and the focus, insane. I think you're talking about. I think he's already one of the all-time greats, but he's getting close to that kind of Lewis, Michael level of, like, you can't argue against this guy being the greatest ever already. Yeah. So just loads to look forward to. What about you? Quick one. I want to throw it back to you. What do you think?
I'll have this at the end of. I think if you're the last or the second last interview I have in the preseason, I'll have my summary at the end. But at the moment, it's currently a bit delusional with Charles first.
Nice.
Lando second, Max third.
Okay, I like that. I was thinking about Charles winning, and I honestly, that's the thing. If you gave me £20 or $20, 20 English pounds, $20, and said bet on someone to win the championship, I'd probably end up with 4 different bets. I'd split them. I'd split my money. I'd hedge because I just don't. I don't know. Maybe there'll be a clear picture coming out of testing. But the thing with testing is, with this season, because there's so much focus on 26, because they're all so close anyway. We know they're going to be close. We know it's going to be tight. So and that alone is just such a good reason for this season to be one of the best ever.
It's just I've got kind of a finger in the air prediction. I've got no clue, and I think testing, as you say, will be such a change on what we think people will do and how they'll perform and such. So I don't think a Charles, Lando, Max is anywhere close to what it will be, or it could be by the end of the season. I just have no idea. But you'll definitely see one team in pre-season or after 5 or 6 races, look completely off the pace out of McLaren, Ferrari, and Red Bull, and they'll just be like, okay, forget about 25. Let's just focus on 2026.
Let's call it. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, that's great, mate. Thank you for sharing those picks. I'll, as I said, condense them, and we'll have a summary of you and a bunch of other guys I've got on the channel for pre-season.
Nice. And I mean, if they turn out to be ice cold takes, then please do. Anyone listening, please do send me some insulting messages online, because ultimately they're just fun guesses, right? So we'll see how
Truly.
good they are down the line. So
Truly, Nate. Well, thank you for coming on again, mate. Great
Thanks
to
for
learn
having
a
me,
bit
mate. Thank
more
you so much.
about the book, your storylines for the upcoming season, and exciting to see how things go for you and ESPN for 2025.
Thanks, mate. Loved it.
Cheers. So guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. This is part of my guest interview series on the channel this year. So if there are other guests you'd love to see me speak to about Formula One for the upcoming season, please let me know down in the comments below. I'll be back with plenty more F1 and F1 fantasy content in the lead up to the Australian Grand Prix and throughout the year. So do subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. In the meantime, have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you all very soon.